A millionaire CEO divorced his infertile wife. 2 years later, she appeared at his baby shower with a baby and whispered, "Your wife is holding her ex's baby." Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories, your own family channel. May the Almighty pour His strongest blessings upon every woman here, granting you health that renews, strength that never bends, and a heart so loving it becomes a shelter for generations. You are the quiet power behind families, the patience in hard days, the light that never stops giving even when tired. May your sacrifices be rewarded, your tears turned into peace, and your lives wrapped in honor and deep respect. I pray that your homes are protected, your bodies stay strong, and your souls remain calm no matter what life brings. May success walk toward you gently, may love surround you daily, and may your worth never be questioned, because you are precious beyond words. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." Brandon McMullen believed his life was finally perfect as he stood in his marble mansion, accepting congratulations for the son his pregnant wife would deliver soon, surrounded by people who celebrated his wealth more than his impending fatherhood, drinking champagne that cost more than most families spent on groceries in months. The baby shower glittered with excess and emptiness, designer everything creating an atmosphere of success that felt hollow, even as Brandon smiled and played the role of excited father-to-be alongside Danny, his second wife, who wore her pregnancy like an expensive accessory requiring constant admiration and attention. Then the doors opened, and Nicola Carey walked into his mansion carrying an infant against her chest, while a small girl with thick curls gripped her hand, and the room fell into shocked silence, because everyone recognized Brandon's first wife, the woman he'd divorced after fertility treatments failed repeatedly, and blame became the foundation of every conversation, destroying what love had once existed between them. Nicola moved through the frozen crowd with devastating grace, her natural beauty untouched by the designer surgery and expensive treatments that Danny required to feel adequate, and beside her walked a tall man with gentle eyes who held the little girl's other hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, his presence radiating quiet strength that money could never purchase or replicate. She approached the gift table, and Danny simultaneously, her smile cold and precise as she leaned close enough to whisper words that detonated Brandon's entire existence. "Congratulations on your son, Danny. He's Brandon's, I'm sure. But this one..." Nicola lifted the infant slightly. "She's one of your twin daughters, Brandon, the ones you fathered while your mother convinced you I was broken." The man beside Nicola introduced himself to the frozen crowd as Alex Hales, her husband and the adoptive father of River and Willow, his hand protective on the little girl's shoulder, making clear without words that he'd been the real father while Brandon was busy building empires and destroying marriages. Nicola placed a wrapped box on the gift table, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Medical records, your fertility tests from samples I had analyzed after our divorce. The originals your mother made disappeared during our marriage. Turns out you were the problem all along, Brandon. Both twins are yours, conceived during our marriage while your mother hid the evidence and let everyone blame my body for being defective." She turned to leave without waiting for response, Alex guiding their small family toward the door with calm efficiency. But Nicola paused long enough to meet Brandon's eyes across the room with expression that promised nothing good. "The second twin is in the car. Willow didn't want to come inside. She's more forgiving than River here, which is why I'm protecting her from this house and what it represents." The room erupted as they left. Danny stood frozen with her hands on her pregnant belly, her face pale with realization that her marriage was ending in front of everyone who'd envied her lifestyle. Brandon's mother dropped crystal that shattered against Italian marble, her expression revealing guilt that confirmed Nicola's accusation before she could formulate denial. Guests pulled out phones to capture the scandal unfolding in real time for social media audiences who would devour this story like entertainment rather than the destruction of actual lives. Brandon stood frozen in the center of his perfect mansion, watching everything disintegrate within minutes. his mind racing through memories of clinic visits where Nicola endured procedures alone because he had meetings he couldn't miss. Arguments where his mother's whispered suggestions poisoned his view of the wife he'd once loved enough to marry, despite family disapproval, divorce papers he'd filed, believing he was freeing himself to find someone who could give him the children he desperately wanted. The gift box sat on the table like evidence at a crime scene, and Brandon's hand shook as he reached for it, knowing whatever Nicola left would confirm the worst truth possible. His mother lunged forward, trying to intercept the box, screaming that it was lies and manipulation, but Brandon pushed her aside with force that surprised them both, his rage at her interference finally breaking through years of dutiful obedience to her subtle manipulations. Inside the box, he found 2 sets of medical records. The first was his original fertility test from their marriage, showing problematic sperm count and motility issues that his mother had told him were inconclusive and nothing to worry about, while she encouraged him to keep pressuring Nicola to do more invasive procedures. The second was the same test run again after their divorce, using samples Nicola had somehow accessed, confirming that the results were identical and definitive. His mother had lied. She'd hidden medical evidence that would have changed everything about how he approached their fertility struggles, let him blame Nicola for biological failures that were equally his responsibility, encouraged the divorce when she could have encouraged them to explore solutions together. The paperwork included a letter from the fertility specialist who'd treated them, written after Nicola contacted her post-divorce, explaining that she'd shared the original results with both patients, but that Brandon's mother had been present at that appointment and had later convinced Brandon the results were meaningless. The doctor's carefully worded note suggested professional concern about family interference in medical care without explicitly accusing anyone of tampering, but the implication was clear enough. Brandon looked at his mother and saw a stranger, someone who'd orchestrated the destruction of his marriage through deliberate deception rather than just passive bigotry, and the realization that his entire adult life had been curated by someone who valued racial purity and social status more than his happiness was too massive to fully process in that moment. "You knew," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos inside his head. "You knew I was the problem, and you hid it from me. You destroyed my marriage on purpose." His mother's face cycled through expressions, settling on defiant righteousness that revealed she didn't see her actions as wrong, but rather as necessary intervention to save him from a mistake. "That woman was never good enough for you, Brandon. You needed children with someone appropriate, someone from our world who could give you the life you deserved. I did what any mother would do to protect her son from wasting his life on someone who would have dragged you down, regardless of whose biology was at fault." The racism underneath her justification was so blatant that Brandon finally heard what he'd been deaf to during his entire marriage, and the confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. He told her to leave his house immediately, that she was no longer welcome in his life or any future relationship with children she'd worked so hard to prevent him from having with Nicola. And when his father tried to defend her, Brandon told them both that choosing his mother's approval over his wife's well-being had been the biggest mistake of his life, and he was done enabling her poison. They left in outrage, threatening lawyers and disinheritance and complete family rupture, but Brandon felt nothing but relief watching them go, because cutting out the infection required accepting that the wound existed in the first place. Danny approached him after his parents left, her voice small and uncertain as she tried to process whether their marriage would survive this revelation, or whether Brandon would blame her somehow for his failures with Nicola, and the question in her eyes revealed that she'd always known she was second choice, that Brandon had married her to prove his divorce from Nicola was justified, rather than because he actually loved her enough to build a life together. He looked at his pregnant wife carrying his biological son and felt absolutely nothing except guilt that he'd used her as proof of concept for his own adequacy, that he'd created another child while missing the first 7 years of his daughter's lives, that he was going to be a father twice over and had no idea how to actually be present for any of them, because he'd spent his entire adult life running from his own failures instead of facing them. "I need to fix this," he said to Danny, gesturing vaguely toward where Nicola had stood. I need to know my daughters. I need to understand what I destroyed. Danny's response was quiet and resigned. And what about us? What about this baby? Brandon couldn't answer that question honestly without admitting that he didn't know if he could be a good father to the son she carried when his mind would always be haunted by the daughters he'd never met. So he said nothing and let the silence confirm what they both already understood about the future of their marriage. He walked out of his own baby shower carrying the gift box that contained proof of his mother's betrayal and his own willful blindness, leaving behind the wreckage of his second marriage and the fractured relationship with parents who'd never deserved his loyalty, heading toward his car with only one thought consuming his mind. He had daughters, twin girls who existed because Nicola had been strong enough to survive his abandonment while pregnant, who'd grown up without their father because he'd been too weak to question his mother's version of reality, and one of them hadn't even wanted to come inside his house because she was too forgiving and needed protection from what his world represented. Brandon sat in his car, staring at the medical reports that rewrote his entire understanding of his first marriage, at photographs Nicola had included showing two beautiful girls with his eyes and smile, and he understood that whatever came next would require him to become someone completely different from the man who'd let his mother orchestrate the destruction of his family. The question was whether Nicola would ever give him the chance to try, or if some betrayals were too devastating to recover from, regardless of how much the person who made them might change. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Disappeared. Nicola woke before dawn in the home she'd built with Alex. Sleep impossible when your carefully constructed peace gets shattered by choices made in rage and righteousness that felt justified in the moment, but terrifying now that consequences were coming. Alex was already awake beside her, his hand finding hers under the covers without words, because their marriage had reached the point where silence communicated more than speeches ever could. She knew he was terrified that Brandon's sudden awareness of the twins would destroy the family they'd built together through love and daily presence, rather than biology and legal claims that courts might prioritize over everything that actually mattered about parenting. River slept soundly in her bed across the hall, exhausted from the emotional intensity of confronting Brandon at his baby shower, but Willow's room was empty when Nicola checked, and she found her younger daughter curled up on the couch downstairs with her favorite blanket clutched tight, her face showing signs of recent tears that suggested nightmares or anxiety about what yesterday's confrontation would mean for their family. Nicola sat beside Willow and pulled her close, feeling her daughter's small body trembling with barely contained emotion, and when Willow finally spoke, her words cut straight through every justification Nicola had constructed for keeping the twins away from Brandon. "Why didn't you let me see inside the big house, Mama? River got to see him, and I just had to wait in the car like I wasn't important enough to be there too." The question revealed a wound Nicola hadn't anticipated, that protecting Willow from Brandon's world had felt to her younger daughter like being excluded from something her twin got to experience, and the realization that her caution might have created the exact division she was trying to prevent made Nicola's chest tighten with guilt. "You are so important, baby. I kept you in the car because River is stronger about these things, and I thought it would hurt you more to go inside, to see all that wealth and perfection while knowing that man chose it over knowing you existed." Willow was quiet for a long moment, her fingers playing with the edge of her blanket in the way she did when processing difficult emotions, before she asked the question that revealed exactly how different the twins were processing this situation. "But what if I want to know him anyway? Even if he chose wrong before, what if he's trying to choose right now? Does that make me bad for being curious about my biological father?" Nicola felt her heart break, hearing her sensitive daughter feeling guilty for natural curiosity about the man who shared her DNA, and she understood in that moment that River and Willow were going to navigate this situation completely differently, that River's protective rage would clash with Willow's forgiving nature in ways that might divide them unless Nicola handled this carefully. Alex appeared in the doorway still in his sleep clothes, his expression showing he'd heard Willow's question, and he crossed the room to kneel beside the couch, so he was eye-level with both of them, his presence steady and grounding in the way that made him the foundation of their family. Being curious doesn't make you bad, Willow. And loving me doesn't mean you can't wonder about Brandon. People's hearts are big enough for complicated feelings, and you don't have to choose between being loyal to our family and wanting to know where you came from. His generosity toward Brandon, despite having every reason to feel threatened, made Nicola love him even more fiercely, but it also terrified her because she knew that Alex's security in their family was less stable than he pretended, that courts and society, and even their own daughters, might eventually decide that biology mattered more than years of actual parenting. Her phone showed dozens of missed calls and hundreds of messages from numbers she didn't recognize, reporters and lawyers and people from her old life who'd vanished when she needed them, but reappeared now that her pain had entertainment value for audiences who consumed other people's suffering, like it was created for their amusement rather than the destruction of actual lives. Nicola deleted everything without reading because their opinions had mattered exactly nothing when she was pregnant and terrified and completely alone, working herself to exhaustion to save enough money for the birth while Brandon was building his empire and marrying someone else who supposedly could give him the children he wanted. River emerged from her bedroom still half asleep and immediately crawled onto the couch with them, her body language protective as she positioned herself between Willow and the world, and Nicola watched her daughters unconsciously demonstrate their different approaches to processing trauma, River building walls while Willow wondered if maybe walls weren't always necessary. "He doesn't get to just show up and pretend to be our dad," River announced to no one in particular, her voice still rough with sleep but firm with conviction. "Alex is our dad. Brandon is just the man whose biology we share, and biology doesn't make family." Willow's small voice responded with hesitation that revealed her internal conflict. "But what if he wants to make up for missing everything? Doesn't everyone deserve a chance to try being better?" River's expression hardened in ways that looked far too old for someone so young. He already had his chance. He chose to leave Mama when she needed him most. We don't owe him anything just because he suddenly feels guilty about his choices. The divide between her daughters was forming right in front of Nicola's eyes, and she knew that keeping them united, while allowing each to process this situation according to their own temperament, would be one of the hardest challenges she'd faced as a mother. Alex made breakfast while Nicola showered, his movements in their kitchen practiced and comfortable because he was the one who'd learned what River liked on her pancakes and how Willow refused eggs unless they were scrambled with cheese, these tiny details of fatherhood that Brandon had missed entirely by not existing during the years when everything about parenting was learned through sleepless nights and constant presence. When they finally sat down to eat, River dominated the conversation with plans for how they'd handle Brandon if he tried to contact them, her strategy involving minimal cooperation and maximum emotional distance, while Willow remained mostly quiet, occasionally catching Nicola's eye with expressions that suggested she was already feeling guilty for not sharing her sister's absolute certainty about how to handle their biological father. Nicola's lawyer called before the morning was properly started, warning that Brandon's legal team would likely file motions requesting DNA testing and custody evaluation, moving with speed that proved he was serious about inserting himself into their lives, regardless of what Nicola wanted or what the twins needed for their emotional well-being and stability. She agreed to the testing because fighting it wasted money and delayed inevitable confirmation that would at least eliminate any lingering doubt about paternity, though she knew with absolute certainty that River and Willow were his biological children, even if biology didn't make him their father in any way that actually mattered. Alex took the girls to the park to give Nicola privacy for the legal call, his understanding that she needed space to be furious without performing strength, one of the 1,000 reasons she'd chosen him after Brandon taught her that vulnerability was weakness men exploited rather than protected. The lawyer explained that Brandon's biological relationship gave him legal standing to petition for custody, regardless of Alex's adoption, art that courts increasingly favored biological parents over adoptive ones, in cases where the biological parent was genuinely unaware of the child's existence, rather than having abandoned them through conscious choice. Nicola's hands shook, hearing that Alex's years of daily fatherhood might legally matter less than Brandon's DNA and newly discovered desire to play daddy after missing everything that actually counted. Every sleepless night and doctor's appointment and school performance and bedtime story that built the foundation of actual parenting rather than biological connection. She stood at their kitchen window watching Alex push the twins on swings at the neighborhood park, his patience infinite as River demanded higher while Willow begged him to stop. And she knew with absolute certainty that this man loved her daughters more genuinely than Brandon could ever manufacture through guilt and late-stage parental awakening. But she also noticed something that made her stomach drop, the way Alex's shoulders were tense even from this distance, the way he checked his phone repeatedly like he was waiting for bad news, the way his smile for the twins looked strained around the edges in ways that only someone who knew him intimately would recognize. He was already breaking under the weight of this situation, already questioning whether his presence in River and Willow's lives would become obstacle to their relationship with their biological father, and Nicola realized with dawning horror that she might have to fight to keep Alex even as she fought to protect her daughters from Brandon's disruption. The phone rang again with number she recognized from memory, despite deleting it years ago, Brandon's personal cell that she'd tried to forget, along with everything else about their marriage and divorce. She answered against every instinct, screaming not to engage, and his voice came through the line, breaking with emotion that might have been genuine or performed, depending on whether he'd actually changed in the years since he'd blamed her for biological failures that were equally his responsibility. "Nicola, I need to see them. I need to see my daughters. My mother hid the test results from me. She destroyed our marriage deliberately. I didn't know. Please, I deserve a chance to explain, to apologize, to—" Her response came cold and final before disconnecting, her words cutting through his desperation with precision, born from years of protecting herself and her children from exactly this moment. "You deserve nothing, Brandon. Your mother hid the results, but you chose to believe I was broken rather than questioning her version of reality. You chose your family's approval over your wife's well-being. Those were your decisions, not hers, but the twins deserve to decide for themselves once they're old enough to understand exactly what you are and what you did to us. Until then, you'll do exactly what courts tell you to do and nothing more." The silence after she hung up felt like victory and violation simultaneously. But what haunted her more was the conversation she needed to have with Alex about whether his fear of losing the girls to their biological father would drive him away before Brandon even got the chance to insert himself into their lives. Chapter 3. The family he built while Brandon built empires. Alex Hales had grown up in circumstances that taught him the difference between fathers who created children and fathers who raised them. His own dad disappearing before his first birthday, while his mother worked double shifts to keep them housed and fed, building a life where presence mattered more than paychecks, and love was measured in packed lunches and attended school plays rather than expensive gifts purchased by guilty strangers seeking redemption through money instead of actual effort. He'd put himself through college on scholarships and student loans that took years to repay, choosing education over more lucrative fields because he genuinely believed teaching children was the most important work anyone could do, regardless of society's refusal to compensate it accordingly. And that philosophy shaped everything about how he approached fatherhood when Nicola and her twins entered his life during a routine school day that became extraordinary through one child's fall and another's worried tears. The connection with them developed naturally over months of finding excuses to check on the girls during recess, learning that River approached the world like a warrior protecting her sister, while Willow processed everything through emotional sensitivity that made her cry over injured butterflies and sad stories. And somewhere along the way, he realized he was falling in love with their mother, despite knowing nothing about her except that she worked constantly and raised her daughters alone with fierce devotion that commanded respect. Nicola was different from women who usually interested him, not because of her beauty, which was undeniable, but because of something in her eyes that suggested she'd survived things that would have destroyed weaker people. And when she finally agreed to coffee after months of casual conversation at school pickup, the story she told about her marriage and divorce explained the guardedness he'd sensed from their first meeting. She told him about the twins' biological father during their relationship's early stages, needing him to understand why she kept the pregnancy secret before they got more serious, and Alex's response that she'd protected her daughters from a man who'd proven himself unworthy surprised her into tears because she'd expected judgment rather than support from someone who barely knew her, yet seemed to understand her choices better than people who'd known her for years. Their relationship became serious quickly once trust was established, moving from dating to living together within reasonable time because the twins already adored him, and Alex couldn't imagine his life without these three people who'd become his entire world, and proposing felt less like a question than acknowledging what already existed in every practical sense that mattered. The adoption process was complicated because Nicola had to provide evidence that the biological father was unknown or uninvolved, and she'd been terrified that somehow Brandon would discover the twins through legal paperwork, despite her careful erasure of anything connecting them. But the adoption finalized months before the baby shower that destroyed their careful peace. Alex loved River and Willow with the kind of fierce protective devotion that biology couldn't create or diminish, knowing their preferences and fears and dreams because he'd been present for the daily moments when personalities developed and trust was built through consistency rather than grand gestures or expensive gifts. The suggestion that Brandon's sudden awareness gave him greater claim to fatherhood enraged Alex in ways that challenged his normally calm temperament. But what terrified him more than Brandon's legal rights was his own inadequacy in the face of what their biological father could offer them. Brandon McMullen was wealthy beyond anything Alex could imagine achieving on a teacher's salary, connected to networks of privilege and opportunity that could open doors for River and Willow that Alex could never access, capable of providing educational advantages and life experiences that Alex's modest income simply couldn't match. The rational part of Alex's brain understood that love and presence mattered more than money, but the insecure part whispered that maybe the girls deserved more than what he could give them, that maybe stepping aside would be the truly selfless act, even if it destroyed him to do it. He'd been awake most of the night wrestling with thoughts that felt like betrayal to voice aloud, questioning whether his presence in the girls' lives would eventually become obstacle to their relationship with a biological father who could offer them so much more than Alex's steady presence and modest means. Watching River and Willow sleep in their beds, he'd found himself wondering if they'd be better off with Brandon's wealth and connections than with his love and daily presence. And the fact that he was even considering stepping aside revealed how thoroughly this situation had destabilized his sense of worth as their father. At the park with the twins, Alex's hands shook as he pushed their swings, his mind consumed by calculations about private school tuition he couldn't afford, and college funds he couldn't match, and opportunities he couldn't provide. And for the first time since adopting River and Willow, he wondered if loving them meant giving them up to someone who could give them better. River sensed his distraction immediately, her perceptive nature making it impossible to hide emotional turmoil from her, and she demanded to know what was wrong with uncharacteristic aggression that suggested she was already feeling the instability affecting all of them. "Are you going to leave us because our biological father showed up?" River asked with blunt directness that took Alex's breath away. "Because if you are, just tell us now so we can prepare instead of pretending everything's fine when it's obviously not." The question revealed that River had already considered the possibility of Alex's departure, that she was protecting herself by building walls before he could hurt her, and Alex realized with sickening clarity that his own insecurity was already damaging the children he was trying to protect. He knelt in the park mulch, so he was eye-level with both girls, River's defensive posture and Willow's worried expression breaking his heart, because they shouldn't have to navigate adult fears and inadequacies when they were still processing their own complicated feelings about Brandon's sudden appearance. "I'm not leaving," Alex said firmly, forcing certainty into his voice even though his chest felt tight with doubt. "I'm your father. And nothing changes that. Not biology, Not money, not anything. You're mine, and I'm yours, and that's forever." Willow threw her arms around his neck with force that nearly knocked him over, her relief palpable in the way she clung to him like he was the only stable thing in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and frightening. But River's eyes remained skeptical, her intelligence too sharp to miss the hesitation underneath his promises, and she asked the question that revealed exactly how much damage his doubts had already caused. "Do you promise, Dad? Because adults always say things are forever, and then they change their minds when things get hard. Brandon probably told our mum he'd love her forever, and then he left when she couldn't give him babies. How do we know you won't do the same thing when things get complicated with our biological father?" The comparison to Brandon felt like a knife to the chest, but Alex understood that River needed to test his commitment, to push him to prove he was different from the man who'd abandoned their mother, and he took a deep breath before answering with honesty that felt terrifying but necessary. "You're right that adults sometimes break their promises when things get hard, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared about what Brandon's presence means for our family. But here's the difference between me and him. I'm choosing to stay even when I'm scared. I'm choosing you both every single day, even when things are complicated and uncertain. That's what real love looks like, not the fairy tale version where everything's easy and nothing ever threatens it." River studied his face for a long moment, her expression serious beyond her years, before nodding slowly, like she'd made some internal decision about whether to trust him. "Okay, but if you change your mind, tell us first. Don't just disappear like some adults do when things get too hard." They returned home to find Nicola in their bedroom, and Alex knew immediately from her red eyes that she'd been crying, that the situation was affecting her even more than she was letting the girls see, and he sent River and Willow to their room before joining his wife on their bed. She told him about Brandon's phone call and the lawyer's warnings about custody battles and biological rights trumping adoptive presence. But what she didn't tell him was that she'd sensed his doubts, that she knew he was questioning his place in their family, and Alex realized he needed to be honest with her before his insecurity destroyed them from the inside. "I'm terrified I'm not enough," he admitted quietly, his voice breaking on the words. "Brandon can give them everything I can't. Private schools, college funds, connections, opportunities. What if staying in their lives means limiting what they could become? What if the most loving thing I could do is step aside and let their biological father provide for them in ways I never can?" Nicola's response was immediate and fierce, her hands gripping his face as she forced him to meet her eyes, and the intensity in her expression revealed that his doubts had threatened her in ways Brandon's reappearance never could. Don't you dare consider leaving us because you think Brandon's money matters more than your presence. Those girls don't need wealth, they need you. I don't need you to be rich, I need you to be exactly who you are. If you leave because you think we deserve better, I will never forgive you. Do you understand me? Never." Her fury was born from terror, from the realization that she might lose Alex not to Brandon's interference, but to his own inadequacy, and Alex understood that he'd been so focused on Brandon as external threat that he'd missed how his own doubts were the real danger to their family. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, and this time the certainty in his voice was real because Nicola's fierce defense of him had reminded him that love was a choice both of them made every day regardless of easier alternatives. "Brandon can offer them money, but I'm offering them something he never will. I'm offering them every single day of my life for the rest of theirs. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Nicola whispered against his chest, and they held each other while the storm gathered around them. Two people who'd chosen each other and built a family from love rather than obligation, preparing to defend what they'd created against forces that threatened to tear it apart. Chapter 4. The walls close in. Brandon's life collapsed with speed that would be impressive if it wasn't destroying him completely, but what shocked him more than the external destruction was the realization that his second marriage had been built on foundations just as faulty as his first, that Danny's baby was his biological son, but he felt absolutely nothing for the child, except guilt that he'd created another life while missing the first years of his daughter's existence. The medical records Nicola left at the baby shower became public through channels Brandon couldn't identify. His mother's deliberate deception splashed across gossip sites and business publications that framed the story as either tragic manipulation or justified maternal protection, depending on which narrative generated more clicks and sympathy from audiences who consumed scandal like entertainment. His company's board called emergency meetings to discuss his temporary resignation. Investors questioning whether a CEO who'd been so thoroughly deceived by his own mother could be trusted to make sound business decisions, and the irony that his professional competence was being judged by his personal failures wasn't lost on Brandon during sleepless nights reviewing what remained of his life. But what haunted him more than the business consequences or public humiliation was the growing awareness that even if he'd never divorced Nicola, even if he'd known about the twins from the beginning, he would have failed them anyway, because he fundamentally didn't know how to be present for people rather than just providing for them financially. Danny went into Labor Days after the baby shower, and Brandon attended the birth out of obligation rather than excitement, watching his son emerge into the world and feeling the same hollow emptiness that had characterized his entire second marriage. He held the infant who shared his DNA and tried to feel the overwhelming love that parents described, the instant connection that was supposed to make everything else in life seem less important. But all he felt was awareness that this child deserved better than a father who was already emotionally absent while physically present. Danny named their son without consulting Brandon, choosing a name from her family rather than his, and her pointed exclusion from that decision revealed that she already understood their marriage was over, even if the legal paperwork hadn't been filed yet. The weeks after his son's birth should have been focused on bonding with his newborn, learning how to change diapers and manage feeding schedules and navigate the exhausting reality of infant care. But instead, Brandon found himself obsessed with the daughters he'd never met, scrolling through the limited photographs Nicola had included in that gift box and wondering what River and Willow's infant years had looked like without him. He tried to be present for his son, tried to force himself to feel the connection that should have come naturally, but every moment with the infant reminded him of everything he'd missed with the twins, and the guilt of that displacement was suffocating in ways he couldn't explain to Danny without admitting that he'd failed as a father to their child before even really beginning. His mother's attempts to contact him were blocked immediately, her voicemails full of justifications that revealed she still didn't understand that hiding his medical results wasn't protective intervention, but deliberate sabotage. But what he didn't expect was the letter that arrived weeks later, delivered through lawyers rather than directly. The envelope sat on his desk for hours before he opened it, and his mother's handwriting on expensive stationery made him nauseous with anticipation of whatever manipulation she'd crafted to justify her actions. The letter contained no apology. Instead, his mother wrote with chilling certainty, "Brandon, you think those girls will love you because you're trying now, but I know better. One day, they'll treat you exactly the way you're treating me right now. They'll cut you off, they'll choose someone else over you, and you'll finally understand that I was the only one who truly loved you unconditionally. When that day comes, remember that I warned you. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and you'll spend the rest of your life begging for scraps of affection from children who will never see you as their real father. You're chasing ghosts while destroying the only family that ever really mattered." Brandon read the letter 3 times, each word landing like curse he'd have to spend his life trying to outrun, and he understood with dawning horror that his mother hadn't just destroyed his first marriage through manipulation, but had planted poison that would haunt him forever, making him question whether River and Willow's eventual acceptance would ever be genuine or just obligation performed for his benefit. The investigation he'd hired into his mother's actions revealed that she'd done more than just hide test results. She'd contacted the fertility clinic multiple times, requesting copies of his records, had met privately with the doctor to discuss his options for dealing with a wife who couldn't conceive, had even consulted with lawyers about the cleanest way to encourage divorce without making it obvious that she was orchestrating the situation. The evidence of her systematic campaign was so comprehensive that it transformed from suspected interference to documented manipulation, and Brandon's rage was matched by understanding that he'd been complicit through weakness, that choosing parental approval over spousal support had made him responsible even if his mother had been the architect. His father reached out separately, suggesting reconciliation, but Brandon's response that he was choosing his daughters over inheritance led to final rupture, his parents making clear they'd never acknowledge River and Willow as legitimate grandchildren. They threatened to write him out of the family estate completely, and Brandon signed paperwork, rejecting his inheritance without hesitation, because accepting that money meant accepting his parents' view that the twins were mistakes rather than his children. The DNA testing confirmed what everyone knew, that River and Willow were his biological daughters, and Nicola's response through lawyers that DNA changed nothing about his access devastated him more than he'd expected, because he'd hoped that scientific proof might soften her resistance. He attempted reaching out directly despite legal instructions, leaving voicemails and sending letters that her lawyer warned constituted harassment, and his desperation to explain about his mother's manipulation only proved he still didn't understand, that external interference didn't absolve him of responsibility. The supervised visitation got scheduled at neutral location with social worker present, and the absurdity of needing supervision to meet his own children hit him during sleepless nights when pride finally broke enough to let actual remorse take its place. Danny filed for divorce while their son was still an infant, her lawyers painting Brandon as emotionally unavailable and obsessed with his ex-wife, and the characterization was accurate enough that Brandon couldn't mount effective defense without admitting he was failing as father to his son because he was haunted by the daughters he'd never known. The settlement gave Danny full custody with minimal visitation, her reasoning being that he'd proven incapable of being present for children even when they lived with him, and Brandon's lack of protest spoke volumes about his own awareness of inadequacy. His business empire became less important as he pulled back from operations, his focus shifting toward preparing for supervised visit that terrified him more than any board meeting, and colleagues noticed his distraction without understanding that meeting your daughters for first time required different skills than building companies. He read parenting books and consulted psychologists, trying to compress years of missed development into weeks of preparation, but every expert gently suggested that showing up consistently mattered more than perfect preparation, that children needed authenticity rather than performance. The morning of his first supervised visit, Brandon woke surrounded by expensive furniture that felt meaningless, and he understood with devastating clarity that he'd built a life optimized for success rather than connection, that every choice had prioritized achievement over relationship, and that reversing those patterns would require becoming fundamentally different from the man who'd signed divorce papers and moved on. He arrived early with shaking hands, and when the door opened, he saw Nicola first, her expression cold, then Alex holding Willow's hand, while River stood apart defensively, and both girls looked at him like he was a stranger they'd been forced to meet. The little girl who looked like his mother at that age asked the social worker a question that destroyed whatever fantasy he'd constructed. "Do we really have to stay here with the stranger who made our mom cry?" Chapter 5. The Children Who Never Asked for This. River and Willow entered the supervised visitation center with completely different energy that made their twin bond more complicated than outsiders might understand, because River had already decided that hating Brandon was loyalty to their family, while Willow carried secret guilt about being curious whether the man who shared their DNA might actually be worth knowing despite everything he'd done wrong. River took her position as protector seriously, standing between Willow and the stranger their mum called Brandon, with body language that communicated she'd fight anyone, who tried hurting her sister, and her immediate question about why he made their mum cry established control that no adult in the room had anticipated from someone so young. Brandon looked different than River expected, based on photographs she'd found online. Older and sadder and less confident than the man in pictures accepting business awards. And River noticed his hands shaking when he tried introducing himself like they were meeting at birthday party instead of court-mandated visit designed to prove he wasn't dangerous to his own biological children. Willow hung back near Alex's legs, but she didn't hide completely the way River had expected, her natural curiosity about Brandon winning out over fear in ways that made River angry because they were supposed to present united front of rejection rather than Willow's tentative interest, suggesting maybe he deserved a chance. The social worker encouraged conversation through awkward prompts about school and hobbies, but River responded to every question with minimal words delivered in tone that communicated complete disinterest, determined to make this visit as unpleasant as possible so Brandon would understand he wasn't welcome in their lives, regardless of what courts mandated. But Willow undermined River's strategy by actually answering Brandon's questions about her art class and favorite drawing subjects, her natural warmth toward people making it impossible for her to maintain the cold distance that River insisted was necessary for protecting their family. During the first visit's bathroom break, River confronted Willow in the hallway with barely controlled fury that their mum and Alex were kind enough to step away for, demanding to know why Willow was being nice to the man who'd abandoned their mother when she needed him most. "He didn't know we existed," Willow said quietly, her eyes filling with tears because she hated conflict, especially with her twin. "Maybe if he'd known about us, he would have stayed with Mama. We don't know what would have happened if he'd known." River's response was harsh and unforgiving. "He left Mama because he thought she was broken. That's worse than not knowing we existed because it means he's the kind of person who abandons people when they need help. We can't trust him just because he's being nice now that he feels guilty." The divide between them was forming in ways that went beyond just different temperaments because Willow's forgiving nature made her want to believe people could change, while River's protective instincts made her certain that trusting Brandon would lead to more disappointment and pain. Brandon brought gifts to the second visit despite being told not to, expensive toys that River rejected immediately, while Willow accepted hers with quiet thank you that made River feel betrayed, even though she understood her sister wasn't trying to hurt her by being polite. Willow asked Brandon during third visit why he didn't love their mom enough to stay married, her question innocent and genuinely curious rather than accusatory, and Brandon's stumbling attempt to explain complicated adult failures only made River angrier while making Willow more sympathetic to how hard it must be for him to face his mistakes. The visits stretched across weeks where River's hostility remained consistent, while Willow's careful warming toward Brandon created tension at home that neither twin knew how to navigate without feeling like they were betraying someone they loved. Nicola noticed the division between her daughters immediately, the way River would storm off to her room after visits, while Willow lingered wanting to talk about whether Brandon seemed nice or if maybe he was trying hard to make up for past mistakes, and the realization that keeping her daughters united while allowing each to process this situation according to their own temperament became one of the hardest challenges she'd faced as a mother. Alex attended every visit sitting quietly in corner with Nicola, his present security blanket. Both twins kept checking to confirm he hadn't left them alone with this stranger, and even Willow's growing comfort with Brandon never extended to choosing him over Alex in any meaningful way that might suggest biological connection mattered more than years of actual parenting. River's teacher called about behavioral changes at school, the normally focused student becoming distracted and aggressive with classmates who asked questions about her biological father showing up after years of absence, and her grades slipped as she processed anger about the visits through acting out in ways that suggested deeper emotional struggle. Willow started having nightmares, but hers were different from River's, not about being taken away, but about having to choose between the family she loved and the biological father she was starting to believe might deserve a second chance. And the guilt she felt over her own forgiving nature kept her awake nights, wondering if being curious about Brandon made her disloyal to Alex. The twins fought more than they ever had before, their previously strong bond fractured by disagreement about how to handle Brandon's presence. And River's accusation that Willow was betraying their family by being nice to him landed like bomb that exploded their careful twin unity into sharp fragments that cut them both. "I'm not betraying anyone," Willow cried during one particularly brutal argument. "I can love Dad and still wonder about Brandon. Why can't you understand that people's hearts are big enough for complicated feelings?" River's response revealed the fear underneath her anger. "Because if you start loving him, then maybe you'll decide biology matters more than everything Dad has done for us. And then our family will fall apart, just like Mama's marriage did. And it will be your fault for not staying loyal." The accusation that Willow's forgiving nature could destroy their family was so unfair that even River knew she'd gone too far. But the damage was done, and the twins spent days barely speaking to each other, while Nicola and Alex tried to mediate without taking sides that would make either daughter feel unsupported. Brandon's visit that coincided with River's soccer game became turning point when River told him through social worker that if he really wanted to know them, he should come watch her play instead of sitting in fake room asking stupid questions, her challenge designed to test whether he'd show up for something that mattered to her or whether his interest was just performance for courts rather than genuine desire to build relationship. He attended the game sitting far from Nicola and Alex in bleachers, and River played with fierce determination that reminded everyone why she'd made the competitive team despite being young for her age group. And when she scored the winning goal, she looked first to Alex for approval the way she always did, her eyes seeking his validation before anything else mattered. But then, something happened that neither River nor anyone else expected. As River jogged back to her position after the goal, she saw Brandon holding water bottles he'd brought for both twins, and she realized with frustration that she'd forgotten to remind Alex to bring extras because she'd been too nervous about the game to remember basic things. River glanced toward Alex, who was cheering from the sidelines, and she saw him reach into his bag and pull out the exact water bottles she preferred, the ones with the special cap that didn't leak, and instead of calling River over to give them to her, Alex did something that made River's chest tighten with confused emotion. He walked calmly across the field during the break between plays, approached Brandon without hostility or performance, and silently handed him the water bottles before returning to his seat beside Nicola. Brandon looked shocked, staring at the bottles in his hands like he couldn't quite process what had just happened. And when River jogged over during the water break, she saw that Brandon was offering her the exact water she needed, provided by Alex, but delivered by Brandon in a moment of cooperation that neither River nor Willow had ever witnessed between their two fathers. "Alex gave me these for you both," Brandon said quietly, his voice carrying gratitude that made River uncomfortable because she didn't want to see him as human who could be grateful for small kindnesses. "He said you need these specific ones." River took the water bottle without thanking Brandon, but something in her chest shifted watching him accept help from the man who had won so completely that he could afford to be generous. And the silent exchange between Alex and Brandon revealed more about their complicated dynamic than any conversation could have captured. Willow, who'd been watching from the bench, saw the whole interaction and immediately understood its significance in ways that River was still processing. And when they got in the car to go home with Nicola and Alex, Willow whispered to River, "Dad isn't scared of Brandon anymore. Did you see that?" River had seen it, and the recognition that Alex's security in his position as their real father was so complete that he could help Brandon without feeling threatened made River's absolute certainty about rejecting Brandon waver just slightly, because if Alex wasn't afraid of Brandon's presence in their lives, maybe River didn't need to be either. Chapter 6. The Battle for Custody and Control. Nicola's lawyer warned her that Brandon's legal team was preparing comprehensive custody petition, arguing that supervised visitation should progress to alternating weekends and eventually shared custody based on his biological rights and demonstrated commitment over months of consistent attendance. But what worried the lawyer more was Brandon's apparent willingness to maintain substantial financial obligations, even beyond what courts might require, suggesting he had resources to sustain prolonged legal battle that Nicola's modest success couldn't match indefinitely. The strategy felt predatory and entitled in ways that made Nicola's blood boil, this man who'd missed everything from pregnancy to first steps, now demanding equal access to her daughter's lives like biological connection outweighed years of actual parenting. But what terrified her more than Brandon's legal rights was the way Willow's growing curiosity about him might be used against her in custody evaluations that measured children's stated preferences alongside parental fitness. She hired child psychologists to evaluate River and Willow's emotional state, building evidence that forced visitations were causing genuine harm through documented anxiety and behavioral changes. But the psychologist's report revealed uncomfortable truth that while River showed clear distress about Brandon's presence, Willow demonstrated normal adjustment that suggested she was processing the situation healthily rather than being traumatized by contact with her biological father. Alex supported the legal fight financially, despite his teacher's salary being inadequate to cover mounting bills, taking on additional work and depleting savings they'd been building toward buying a house, and his commitment to fighting for their family was absolute, even as the financial and emotional toll affected his health in ways he tried hiding from Nicola to avoid adding more stress to her already overwhelming burden. The twins became pawns in legal chess game, neither understood, but both felt acutely through increased therapy appointments, psychological evaluations, interviews with court-appointed advocates who asked uncomfortable questions about which parent they preferred and why they felt closer to their adoptive father than their biological one. River's answers to the court advocate were exactly what Nicola wanted to hear. Absolute statements that Alex was her only father and Brandon was just a stranger trying to buy their affection with expensive gifts and forced niceness. But Willow's responses were more complicated and nuanced in ways that could be interpreted as openness to expanding their family structure to include biological father alongside adoptive one. The court-appointed child advocate submitted report that acknowledged the twins' different comfort levels with Brandon, but recommended gradual progression to unsupervised visitation based on his consistent effort and the fact that neither child showed signs of being in danger from him, even if one remained emotionally resistant to bonding. Nicola read recommendation with shaking hands, feeling like she was losing control over protecting her daughters from a man who'd proven himself unworthy during their marriage. Her rage at system that prioritized biological connection over demonstrated love, making her want to grab the twins and run to somewhere Brandon's lawyers couldn't reach them. But what devastated her more than the legal recommendations was the growing awareness that her own trauma from Brandon's abandonment might be influencing how she framed this situation for River and Willow, that her need to punish him for destroying her could be preventing the girls from making their own informed decisions about whether their biological father deserved place in their lives. Alex held her through another night of crying about unfairness of courts that could force her children to have relationship with someone who'd failed their mother so completely, but his comfort was less certain than usual because he was wrestling with his own demons about whether his presence in the custody battle was helping or hurting the twins' long-term interests. Brandon's lawyers filed motions requesting overnight visits, starting with one night monthly, arguing that relationship development required more than supervised 2-hour sessions and that Brandon had demonstrated sufficient commitment and appropriate boundaries to warrant progression toward more normal custody arrangement. The escalation felt like violation for Nicola, her daughter's lives being restructured to accommodate man who'd never earned right to their time through anything except biology and legal persistence. But the courts were unmoved by her arguments that Brandon's late-stage parental interest didn't entitle him to disrupt the stability River and Willow had known their entire lives. Brandon hired parenting consultant to prepare for potential unsupervised visits, but what surprised Nicola's investigator who'd been monitoring his activities was that Brandon seemed genuinely struggling with the role, rather than just going through motions to satisfy court requirements. That his consultant meetings often ended with him appearing frustrated and overwhelmed in ways that suggested he was beginning to understand how unprepared he was for actual fatherhood versus fantasy version he'd constructed. Nicola's mother appeared for first time in years after seeing Scandal on television, her unexpected presence adding another layer of complication because she wanted to help her daughter fight Brandon, but their relationship was so fractured from years of judgment about Nicola's marriage choices and single parenthood that her assistance felt more like interference than support. The family dynamics got increasingly complicated as Brandon's parents remained completely absent after he'd rejected them for their role in destroying his first marriage. While Nicola's mother tried inserting herself into grandchildren's lives she'd barely acknowledged when they weren't newsworthy, and both twins resented this grandmother who appeared for drama but had missed every birthday and holiday that came before. Alex's position became more precarious as legal arguments centered on biological versus adoptive parenthood, and during particularly brutal deposition, Brandon's lawyers questioned whether Alex's teaching salary was adequate to provide the educational opportunities and life experiences that Brandon's wealth could offer River and Willow, implying that keeping Alex as primary father was actually limiting the girls' potential futures. The questions about his financial adequacy broke something in Alex that he'd been barely holding together. His deepest insecurities about not being enough for River and Willow, weaponized in legal proceeding designed to establish custody arrangements, and he left the deposition shaking with rage and humiliation that his love for the twins was being measured against Brandon's bank account rather than years of actual parenting. That night, Alex told Nicola he was considering whether stepping back might actually be best for the girls, whether his pride in being their father was preventing them from accessing opportunities Brandon could provide, and Nicola's fury at him for even suggesting he'd abandon them was matched by her terror that the legal battle was destroying their family from within more effectively than Brandon's interference ever could. "If you leave us, I will never forgive you," she said with intensity that bordered on violence. "Brandon's lawyers want you to believe you're not enough so they can clear the path for their client. Don't let them win by actually leaving. Fight with me, not against me." Alex's breakdown was complete and devastating, his careful composure shattered by months of being told implicitly and explicitly that his adoptive status made him less legitimate than biological father who'd missed everything, and Nicola held him while he sobbed about feeling inadequate and wondering if loving the twins meant giving them up to someone who could provide more. "They don't need more," Nicola whispered fiercely. "They need you, exactly as you are. Brandon can throw money at them forever, and it won't make him their father the way you are. Please don't leave us. Please." The school received media attention as reporters tried interviewing teachers and parents about the custody battle, forcing administrators to implement strict protocols that Alex helped design to protect River and Willow's privacy, and his professional involvement in protecting the twins from predatory journalism reminded him that he was their father in every way that actually mattered regardless of what legal proceedings suggested about biological primacy. River's soccer season ended with championship win that should have been pure celebration, but Brandon's attendance at the ceremony divided the twins between River's grudging acknowledgement that he'd shown up consistently for her games and Willow's open happiness that both her fathers were present for important achievement. Nicola watched her daughters navigate impossible situation where loving Alex felt like it should mean rejecting Brandon, but Willow's forgiving nature refused that binary, and she realized that perhaps her own need for revenge against Brandon was creating division between her daughters that served no one's interests except her own wounded pride. The legal bills mounted into territory that required Nicola to take out loans against her house. Her career success still no match for Brandon's wealth when it came to funding prolonged custody battle, and the practical reality that she might have to accept less favorable terms simply because she couldn't afford to keep fighting infuriated her beyond measure. But what broke her finally was the realization that River and Willow were suffering more from watching their family be torn apart by legal warfare than they would from simply allowing Brandon supervised access to their lives. That her need to punish him was hurting the very children she was trying to protect. The judge's preliminary ruling arrived, granting Brandon one supervised overnight visit monthly, with progression to unsupervised if trial period went well. And Nicola's scream of rage and grief brought Alex and both twins running to find her sobbing at kitchen table, with phone displaying legal order that would force River and Willow to sleep under Brandon McMullen's roof for first time in their lives. But in the midst of her breakdown, Willow climbed into her lap and whispered something that changed everything. "Mama, maybe it won't be as scary as you think. Maybe he's trying really hard to be better. Can we at least see before deciding it's the worst thing ever?" Chapter 7. The Long Fall from Grace. Brandon's first overnight visit with twins was scheduled for weeks after Judge's ruling, and the time he spent preparing revealed to him exactly how hollow his success had been when measured against basic parenting skills he'd never bothered developing, his wealth and business acumen completely useless for creating environment where young girls might actually feel comfortable spending night away from the only home and parents they'd ever known. He hired interior designer for the guest room but fired her after seeing the sterile perfection she created, understanding finally that children needed spaces that felt lived in rather than showcased, and his second attempt at creating their room involved actually researching what River and Willow liked rather than what he thought they should like based on expensive catalogs and designer recommendations. His company's board had formally requested his resignation as CEO, and Brandon accepted with less fight than anyone expected because the business empire he'd built was so clearly compensation for personal failures rather than genuine passion, and losing it felt almost like relief from having to pretend that success measured in profits mattered more than success measured in whether his daughters would ever trust him. The divorce from Danny finalized with settlement that gave her full custody of their son, and required Brandon to pay substantial support despite his minimal involvement in the infant's life, and the terms were punitive but accurate, given that he'd been emotionally absent as father even when physically present, and his lack of protest against the arrangement spoke volumes about his own awareness of his inadequacy. Danny's pointed comment during final settlement meeting that he'd failed as father to the son who actually lived with him didn't bode well for his chances with daughters who'd lived entire lives without him, and Brandon couldn't dispute her assessment because she was right that showing up physically meant nothing if you weren't actually present emotionally. His parents' final communication came not through phone calls or face-to-face meetings, but through a letter his mother sent via lawyers, and Brandon knew before opening it that whatever she'd written would contain no apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing, because people like her never believed they'd done anything wrong. But what he found inside was worse than expected. A letter that felt less like communication and more like curse, designed to haunt him forever. The expensive stationery carried his mother's perfect handwriting, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. "Brandon," the letter began without warmth or familial affection, "you think you're doing the right thing by choosing those children over your family, but I know something you haven't yet learned. One day, those girls will treat you exactly the way you're treating me right now. They'll cut you off when you're inconvenient. They'll choose the man who raised them over the man whose DNA they carry. They'll make you beg for scraps of their attention and affection, and you'll finally understand that I was the only one who truly loved you unconditionally." Brandon's hands shook as he continued reading, his mother's words landing like prophecy he'd spent his life trying to outrun. "You think showing up now makes you their father, but you're chasing ghosts while destroying the only family that ever really mattered. When River and Willow reject you, When they tell you that Alex Hales is their real father and you're just the biological stranger who abandoned their mother, remember this letter. Remember that I warned you. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and you'll spend the rest of your life paying for the privilege of being tolerated by children who will never truly see you as theirs. I hope it's worth it. The letter wasn't signed with love or even her name, just her initials, as if she couldn't bear to claim full ownership of the curse she was placing on his attempts at redemption. Brandon read it 3 times, each word sinking deeper into his psyche, planting seeds of doubt about whether River and Willow's eventual acceptance would ever be genuine or just obligation performed for his benefit, and he understood that his mother had found a way to poison his future even after he'd cut her out of his life. He burned the letter in his kitchen sink, watching the expensive paper curl and blacken, but the words remained in his memory like scar tissue that would never fully heal, and he knew that every interaction with River and Willow would be haunted by his mother's prediction that they'd eventually treat him the way he'd treated her. The irony wasn't lost on him that she'd compared his situation to her own, as if cutting off a mother who deliberately destroyed his marriage was equivalent to the twins maintaining boundaries with a biological father who'd never been present for their lives. But the comparison would haunt him regardless of its logical flaws, because doubt didn't require rationality to take root. Brandon volunteered at children's literacy program in neighborhoods where his wealth was obscene compared to families struggling with basic needs, and the kids he tutored were brutally honest about when his help was useful versus when he was being condescending rich guy playing savior, and their feedback taught him more about connecting with children than any consultant had managed because they had no investment in protecting his feelings or pretending he was doing better than he actually was. One child asked him directly why he was volunteering if he had so much money, whether it was guilt or boredom or genuine desire to help, and Brandon's stumbling non-answer made the kid laugh and tell him he needed to figure out his own motivations before trying to help other people because inauthentic charity was worse than no charity at all. He read everything he could find about adoptive family dynamics and blended families, trying to understand Alex's position in River and Willow's lives, and the research made painfully clear that his biggest mistake was viewing Alex as obstacle rather than partner in caring for daughters who loved him regardless of biology, that competing with Alex would guarantee failure while respecting his primary position might create space for Brandon to build something alongside rather than instead of what already existed. Brandon reached out to Alex directly against both lawyers' advice, requesting meeting to discuss co-parenting without competition, and Alex's agreement to meet surprised him because he'd expected rejection from Man, with every reason to view him as threat. Their conversation in neutral coffee shop was awkward and tense initially, 2 men who loved same children from completely different positions trying to navigate territory neither had anticipated, but Alex's blunt honesty about Brandon needing to accept permanent secondary status helped clarify expectations in ways lawyers never could. "You'll never be their dad," Alex said, without hostility, but with absolute certainty. "That title is mine because I earned it through years of being there for everything. You can be Brandon, you can be their biological father, you can even eventually be someone they love, but you'll never replace me, and the sooner you accept that, the better chance you have of building something real with them instead of chasing fantasy that will never exist." The words should have hurt, but instead they felt like relief, like someone had finally given Brandon permission to stop trying to reclaim position he'd forfeited through his own failures, and instead build something new from the ruins of what could have been. Brandon admitted to Alex that he was also failing as father to his son with Danny, that his infant biological child should have been his focus, but instead he was haunted by the daughters he'd never met, and Alex's response that maybe Brandon needed to figure out how to be present for one child before trying to parent 3 suggested depths of insight that Brandon's expensive consultants had never managed. "Your son deserves a father who actually wants to be there for him," Alex continued. "Not someone who's physically present but mentally elsewhere. If you can't be fully present for the child you're actually raising, what makes you think you can be present for River and Willow?" The question hit Brandon like physical blow because it forced him to confront truth he'd been avoiding, that his pursuit of the twins was partially about running from failure with his son rather than actually wanting to do the hard work of being present for any of the children who shared his DNA. He left the meeting with Alex feeling simultaneously more hopeless and more clear about what he needed to do, and over the following weeks, Brandon made genuine effort to be present for his son during his minimal custody time, to learn how to change diapers and manage feeding schedules, and actually pay attention to the infant rather than treating him as obligation to fulfill before returning to obsessing about River and Willow. The effort revealed how thoroughly he'd failed during those first months of his son's life, how much he'd missed by being physically present but emotionally absent, and the recognition of that failure helped him understand what Nicola must have felt during their marriage when he'd been there in body but not in spirit, always focused on work or his mother's approval rather than the woman who needed him to actually see her. His apartment transformation continued with input from child psychologist about creating spaces that felt safe rather than impressive, and Brandon found himself actually enjoying the process of choosing things based on what River and Willow might like, rather than what looked expensive or impressive to adults who would never see these rooms. He practiced cooking simple meals and researched age-appropriate activities and bought board games that encouraged interaction, and for first time in his adult life, Brandon was preparing for something that mattered more than business success or social status, preparing to be adequate rather than excellent, because adequacy would be achievement for someone who'd never prioritized relationship over achievement. The evening before first overnight visit, Brandon received text from Nicola's number, containing photograph of River and Willow holding handmade sign with rules for him, and Willow had clearly drawn decorative border around the words, while River's handwriting spelled out expectations that revealed both girls' personalities perfectly. The message from Nicola was simple. They made this themselves. Willow wanted to add hearts to make it friendly. River wanted to make sure you understand there are boundaries. Respect both, or the visit gets cancelled. Brandon saved the photograph and stared at it for a long time, at evidence that his daughters were real people with preferences and boundaries rather than abstract concepts he was chasing to assuage guilt, and he promised himself that he'd respect every rule they'd written, even though accepting he'd never replace their dad hurt more than he'd expected. And his mother's letter haunted him with prediction that this would never be enough, that River and Willow would eventually reject him the way he'd rejected her, and he'd spend his life proving that curse wrong or dying in the attempt. Chapter 8. The Mother Who Built Walls from Pain. Nicola spent weeks before Brandon's first overnight visit, alternating between rage at the system that granted it and terror about her daughter spending entire night in care of man who'd failed her so catastrophically when she needed him most. But what complicated her emotions beyond simple protective anger was the growing awareness that her own wounds from their marriage were influencing how she presented Brandon to River and Willow in ways that might not serve their actual best interests. She'd built her entire adult life after the divorce around protecting River and Willow from exactly this scenario, creating stable environment where they felt secure and loved, and watching courts dismantle that protection based on biological connection rather than demonstrated parenting capacity felt like being violated all over again by systems that prioritized men's rights over children's needs. But Willow's gentle questions about whether maybe Brandon deserved a chance to prove he'd changed forced Nicola to examine whether her resistance was entirely about protecting the twins or partially about punishing him for destroying her when she'd needed him most. And that self-examination was more painful than she'd anticipated because it required acknowledging that perhaps her trauma was creating division between her daughters that served her need for revenge rather than their actual well-being. Alex tried reassuring her that Brandon had shown consistency and that overnight visit included emergency protocols, but Nicola's trust in Brandon had been destroyed so thoroughly that no amount of recent good behavior could rebuild faith that he wouldn't hurt their daughters the way he'd hurt her, and her inability to separate her own trauma from the twins' actual safety needs was becoming a problem she couldn't ignore. River and Willow prepared for overnight with their different approaches, River treating it like military operation requiring strategy, while Willow showed tentative excitement, mixed with guilt about feeling anything positive toward biological father their mum so clearly hated. And watching her daughters navigate that divide broke Nicola's heart, because children shouldn't have to manage adult emotional complexity when processing their own feelings about complicated family dynamics. The morning of the visit, Nicola helped twins pack their overnight bags, including comfort items and specific instructions about bedtime routines and dietary preferences, and she fought to keep her voice steady while reminding them they could call any time if they felt unsafe or unhappy, that Alex would come get them immediately, no matter the reason. She'd spent years being both mother and father to these girls, sacrificing everything to ensure they never felt the abandonment she'd experienced when Brandon left, and watching them walk toward his car with their small backpacks felt like handing over her heart to someone who'd already proven himself careless with precious things. Alex stayed with her after twins left, knowing she'd fall apart once they were gone, and they spent afternoon trying to distract themselves, while both checking phones constantly for messages that might indicate something was wrong. And the silence was simultaneously reassuring and maddening, because no news meant nothing terrible was happening, but also meant Nicola had no way to know if her daughters were actually okay, versus just not calling, because they felt obligated to make the visit work. Her mind drifted to memories of her marriage to Brandon and how completely she'd loved him before everything fell apart. The way he'd made her feel chosen, despite his family's obvious disapproval. How the fertility struggles had poisoned their relationship through blame she'd absorbed like it was her responsibility to fix biology that turned out to be equally his failure. She remembered exact moment she'd known their marriage was over, sitting in clinic waiting room alone because Brandon had meeting he couldn't miss, staring at pamphlets about procedures that might help while wondering why loving each other wasn't enough anymore when it had once felt like everything that mattered. The divorce papers had arrived via courier while she was at work. His cowardice in not even delivering them personally preview of how thoroughly he'd erase her from his life once she no longer served his needs, and she'd signed them alone, knowing she'd rather be single forever than stay married to someone who viewed her as defective. The pregnancy discovery weeks later had felt like universe's cruelest joke, giving her the babies they desperately wanted only after he'd decided she was broken beyond repair and moved on to someone supposedly better, and the decision to keep the twins secret had come from place of self-preservation, because telling Brandon meant watching him either reject them or try to take them while offering her nothing but obligatory co-parenting. But the discovery of his mother's deliberate interference, the evidence that Brandon's medical results had been hidden rather than shared honestly, complicated Nicola's narrative about their marriage failure in ways she hadn't fully processed, because acknowledging his mother's manipulation meant acknowledging that maybe Brandon had been victim too, rather than just perpetrator of her suffering. That recognition didn't excuse his choices or absolve him of responsibility for believing his mother over his wife, but it added complexity to the story Nicola had been telling herself and her daughters about why their family existed in its current fractured state. She'd built her career from nothing while raising twins alone, transforming herself into a successful woman Brandon would have admired if he'd bothered to see her potential when they were married, and the satisfaction of that achievement was complicated by awareness that she'd done it partially to prove she didn't need him, that success measured in career advancement was compensation for failure measured in marriage that fell apart. Alex had entered their lives like gift she didn't know she deserved, his genuine kindness toward River and Willow gradually becoming something deeper. And the contrast between Alex's steady presence and Brandon's abandonment had made choosing Alex feel easy, even though Nicola knew that comparing them wasn't entirely fair, because she'd been a different person during her marriage to Brandon, younger and less confident and more willing to absorb blame for things that weren't her fault. The phone rang hours into overnight visit, and Nicola's heart stopped seeing Brandon's number because early calls meant crisis. But River's voice came through telling her they were okay, that Brandon had made spaghetti and it was pretty good, that Willow was nervous but not crying, and that she just wanted to check in like they'd agreed. Nicola cried after the call ended, relief and grief mixing together because her daughters were safe, but also because they were safe without her, learning to navigate relationship with their biological father that she couldn't control or prevent, and that loss of control felt both terrifying and perhaps necessary for allowing River and Willow to make their own decisions about whether Brandon deserved place in their lives. Alex held her through more tears, his understanding that this hurt differently than other losses making his comfort meaningful. And they spent evening talking about how their family was being restructured by forces beyond their control, and whether Nicola's resistance was still serving its original protective purpose, or had become wall that trapped her in past pain rather than present reality. She admitted for first time that maybe her resistance to Brandon wasn't entirely about protecting River and Willow, that some of it was about punishing him for destroying her when she'd needed him most, that years hadn't been enough time to forgive him for letting his mother manipulate their marriage while he built his empire on foundation of their failed relationship. But she also admitted that continuing to punish him might be hurting the twins more than it hurt Brandon, that River's anger and Willow's guilt about her own forgiving nature were partially her fault because she'd presented Brandon as villain rather than complicated human who'd made terrible choices but might be capable of growth. Alex's response, that holding on to rage was understandable but ultimately destructive, challenged Nicola to consider whether boundaries she'd built were still serving their original purpose or had become weapons she was wielding against Brandon at her daughter's expense. The second check-in call came at bedtime, Willow's small voice asking if she could say goodnight even though they'd already talked, and Nicola heard something underneath her daughter's careful fear. Tentative curiosity about whether maybe Brandon's apartment wasn't as scary as she'd imagined, whether spending night away from home might be okay rather than traumatic. Brandon texted after twins were asleep with simple message saying they were safe and thanking her for trusting him, even though he knew she hadn't actually trusted him, but rather been forced by court order, and Nicola deleted the message without responding because acknowledging his effort felt like betraying her own justified anger. But she couldn't stop herself from saving photograph he'd included showing River and Willow asleep in bunk beds, looking peaceful rather than distressed, and that evidence that her daughters were okay without her felt both reassuring and devastating, because it suggested that maybe they didn't need her protection quite as much as she needed to believe they did. Morning came with text containing photos of twins eating pancakes, and Nicola allowed herself smallest acknowledgement that maybe Brandon was trying, even if trying didn't undo years of absence or heal wounds his leaving had carved into her identity. She arrived to pick up twins hours after scheduled end of visit, her delay strategic to see how Brandon handled extension, and she found River teaching him to properly braid Willow's hair while explaining that if he was going to be in their lives, he needed to know basic things that fathers should know. Her daughter unconsciously mothering her biological father made Nicola realize that River was already processing their relationship in more nuanced ways than her angry statements suggested, that perhaps children were more capable of holding complicated feelings than adults gave them credit for. But what broke something in Nicola's carefully maintained walls was watching Brandon follow River's instructions with obvious incompetence but genuine effort, his hands fumbling with Willow's hair while both girls laughed at his mistakes, and the scene of them together without her orchestrating every interaction revealed that maybe allowing them space to build their own relationship with Brandon was necessary, even though it terrified her to surrender that control. Chapter 9. When everything breaks open. The extended visit during school break meant Brandon would have twins for consecutive nights, and Nicola's agreement to the longer duration came with deep reluctance because her control over the twins' exposure to Brandon was slipping with each court ruling that favored biological rights over her protective instincts. But what she couldn't admit even to Alex was that watching River and Willow survive the first overnight had slightly loosened her absolute certainty that Brandon would inevitably hurt them the way he'd hurt her. River had softened considerably toward Brandon over months of visits, her initial rage transforming into complicated mix of grudging respect for his consistency and resentment that his effort now couldn't undo, missing everything before, though she maintained fierce boundaries about him, never replacing Alex regardless of how much time they spent together. Willow's relationship with Brandon had developed differently. her forgiving nature allowing genuine warmth while her sensitivity made her hyper-aware of River's disapproval, and the guilt she carried about liking Brandon created internal conflict that kept her awake nights, wondering if loving both fathers made her disloyal to the family she'd always known. The first nights of extended visit proceeded normally based on text updates, but on the third morning, Nicola's phone rang early with Brandon's voice strained and worried, explaining that River and Willow had woken up with questions about their parents' marriage that required answers he didn't know how to give without damaging them further. Why he didn't love their mum enough to stay married, whether his mother had really hidden medical evidence on purpose, if he'd ever actually wanted children with Nicola, or if the twins were accidents he was pretending to want now, out of guilt rather than genuine love. Nicola's response was defensive, telling Brandon those conversations were hers to have with her daughters, but River's tearful voice in background begging her mum to please come because they needed to understand from both parents rather than just one side of the story broke through her resistance. She arrived at his apartment with Alex, both presenting unified front, and what they found was River and Willow sitting at kitchen table with serious expressions demanding real answers rather than sanitized versions designed to protect them from ugly truths about how families could be destroyed through weakness and manipulation and failures that compounded until love wasn't enough to hold people together. The conversation that followed was brutal and necessary, Nicola and Brandon sitting across from their daughters, attempting to explain how their marriage failed through combination of external pressure and internal weakness. And the questions the twins asked cut straight to heart of issues neither parent wanted to examine but couldn't avoid, without lying to children who deserved honest explanations for why their family existed in its current fractured state. Brandon admitted things Nicola had never expected him to acknowledge in front of their daughters, telling River and Willow that he'd failed their mother completely by believing his mother's manipulation over his wife's truth, that he'd been weak husband who chose parental approval over spousal support, that missing their first years was biggest regret of his life, and that no amount of trying now could undo the damage his failures had caused to everyone involved. But he also revealed something Nicola hadn't known, that he was failing as father to his son with Danny just as thoroughly as he'd failed with the twins, that his infant biological child deserved better than father who was physically present but emotionally absent, haunted by the daughters he'd never met instead of being present for the son he was actually raising. "I have a son with Danny," Brandon said quietly, looking at River and Willow with expression that suggested he'd been wanting to tell them this but hadn't found the right moment. "He's your half-brother, and I'm a terrible father to him because I can't stop thinking about the years I missed with you both. That's not fair to him, and it's not fair to you, and I don't know how to fix it, except to be honest that I'm failing at this, even as I'm trying." The revelation that they had a half-brother shocked both twins into silence, and Willow's immediate question about whether they'd ever meet him revealed her natural curiosity about expanding their family connections, while River's skepticism about whether Brandon could be good father to any of his children showed her protective instincts extending even to sibling they'd never met. Nicola found herself crying while listening to Brandon take accountability without excuses, his honesty more complete than anything she'd heard during their marriage, and some part of her that was still wounded by their divorce felt small piece of healing begin, even though she fought against that softening because forgiving him felt like betraying herself. River asked her mother directly whether she'd kept them secret because she was scared Brandon would reject them, or because she was punishing him by taking away something he didn't know he wanted, and the brutal truth that Nicola's motivations had been both protective and punitive was hard to admit in front of daughters who deserved better than being caught in their parents' war. "Both," Nicola said finally, her voice breaking. "I was terrified he'd reject you the way he'd rejected me. But I was also angry enough that I wanted him to suffer by not knowing you existed. That wasn't fair to him and it wasn't fair to you, and I'm sorry that my need for revenge kept you from knowing your biological father during your early years." The admission cost her something, acknowledging her own failures in a situation where she'd always positioned herself as victim rather than participant in the twins' fractured family structure. but the relief of finally being honest with River and Willow about her complicated motivations outweighed the pain of admitting she'd made choices that hurt all of them. Alex spoke for first time during heavy conversation, addressing River and Willow directly about how families could be complicated without being broken. That biological connection and adoptive love weren't competing forces but rather different kinds of relationships that could exist simultaneously without diminishing either one. His generosity toward Brandon, despite having every reason to feel threatened, made even Nicola see her ex-husband differently. Not forgiving him for past failures, but acknowledging that he was genuinely trying to become someone worthy of River and Willow's time and affection, even though he was still figuring out what that actually meant in practice. The conversation extended for hours as twins asked every question they'd been holding on to, their need to understand complete story overriding adult discomfort with difficult topics, and both Brandon and Nicola answered with raw honesty that was terrifying, but necessary for their daughters to make sense of chaos that adult mistakes had created. Willow asked question that broke everyone, wanting to know if her parents would have stayed married if she and River had been born during marriage instead of after divorce, whether their existence could have saved something that was already broken, and the answer that neither parent could give was that the twins had saved Nicola from marriage that was destroying her, but also represented Brandon's lost chance at being present for family he'd always wanted, but never knew how to build. The emotional intensity exhausted everyone, and River and Willow retreated to their temporary room, while three adults sat in uncomfortable silence processing what had been exposed, and for first time since the baby shower they existed in same space without overt hostility, poisoning every interaction. Nicola looked at Brandon, really seeing him rather than just her anger about what he'd done, noticing how arrogant CEO who'd blamed her for infertility had been replaced by someone humbler and more self-aware, someone who'd lost his business empire and his parents and his second marriage, but gained understanding of why those losses were consequences of his own failures rather than bad luck or other people's mistakes. She still didn't forgive him and might never fully forgive him because some wounds were too deep for time alone to heal, but she could acknowledge that man sitting across from her bearing his failures to their daughters showed more courage than man who'd signed divorce papers and moved on to someone else without looking back. Alex sensed shift in energy between Nicola and Brandon, some slight thawing that didn't threaten their marriage, but rather acknowledged that perhaps ongoing war between Brandon and Nicola was hurting River and Willow more than it was protecting them, and his quiet observation that maybe the twins needed to see their parents capable of civil cooperation gave both of them permission to consider whether they could coexist peacefully, even if they'd never be friends. Brandon asked Nicola if she'd ever be able to forgive him, not for his benefit, but because he genuinely wanted to know whether that door was permanently closed, and her answer, that forgiveness wasn't something he could earn, but rather something she might choose, when the pain of holding on to rage became more destructive than letting it go, felt both honest and devastating to hear spoken aloud. River appeared in doorway, asking if they were done talking because she and Willow wanted to show Brandon card game Alex had taught them. Her resilience reminder that children often recovered faster than adults from trauma because they lived in present rather than past, and all four adults followed twins back to living room where card games felt safer than continued emotional excavation. On drive home after picking up River and Willow, Nicola noticed in rearview mirror that her daughters were holding business card with Brandon's personal number and note in his handwriting saying, "You can call me any time for any reason. I promise I'll answer." And River caught her mum's eyes in mirror before quietly tucking card into her pocket rather than throwing it away like she would have months ago, and that small gesture revealed more about the twins' changing relationship with Brandon than any conversation could capture. Chapter 10. What redemption actually looks like. The time following that brutal family conversation became foundation for something none of them had believed possible, and reconstruction happened through thousands of small moments rather than dramatic reconciliations, because real healing required sustained presence instead of grand gestures. Brandon showed up for everything, every soccer game and school performance and parent-teacher conference where he sat opposite Alex and Nicola, accepting his secondary position, and the consistency gradually shifted from obligation to relationship the twins cautiously valued. River's birthday became watershed when she invited Brandon alongside everyone else, careful to introduce him as Brandon rather than Dad because titles needed earning over years. And that measured acceptance marked progress from the child who'd asked why he made their mum cry. Willow's art show featured family tree project, including both fathers with notation, explaining that families could have different structures, her wisdom more mature than most adults managed, and both parents understood that their younger daughter was teaching them about love's capacity for complexity. Brandon learned to accept that he'd never be their dad regardless of effort, that River and Willow called Alex that and would always call him that, while Brandon remained Brandon with growing affection but appropriate distance, and some losses couldn't be recovered no matter how much he'd changed. The overnight visits became regular weekends as courts recognized sustained commitment. Though Nicola maintained boundaries about decision-making and ensured Alex was always included in discussions about education or medical care or major choices affecting their futures. Brandon's business recovery happened slowly through smaller company focused on ethics rather than maximum profit. His approach transformed by losing everything. But he made genuine effort to be present for his son with Danny, despite minimal custody, taking Alex's observation about being good father to one child before trying to parent three seriously enough to actually change behavior. His parents remained completely severed after their sabotage, and Brandon made peace with that loss because choosing River and Willow over generational wealth proved his priorities had reordered through consequences that stripped away everything except what truly mattered. Nicola watched Brandon prove himself week after week through consistent presence, contributing to college funds that couldn't compensate for missed years but demonstrated commitment, attending therapy sessions where he faced honesty without defensiveness, and gradually she felt rage begin to fade into something less consuming, though never completely disappearing. Alex's position remained secure despite court rulings, his relationship built on years that DNA couldn't replicate, and his generosity in allowing Brandon's integration without territorial competition proved that real fatherhood was about children's well-being rather than adult ego. Whether Nicola would ever forgive Brandon remained unresolved because forgiveness wasn't linear or complete, but happened in small moments when seeing him parent well mattered more than punishing him for years of absence, and she found herself capable of acknowledging growth without pretending past failures didn't still hurt. Their conversations extended beyond logistics into discussions about the twins' development, with Nicola occasionally sharing stories from early childhood that Brandon had missed, and the sharing felt less like reopening wounds and more like allowing him to know his daughter's complete history. Brandon dated occasionally, but nothing serious developed because his complicated situation and emotional energy poured into being reliably present made new relationships impossible, and he accepted this as appropriate consequence for once prioritizing career over marriage. Alex and Nicola renewed their vows, celebrating years together, with River and Willow participating in ceremony honoring the family they'd built, and Brandon was notably absent because some boundaries remained sacred, the family unit existing independently of his biological connection in ways everyone respected. The birthday party marking another year became milestone when twins invited Brandon to their home for first time, rather than neutral locations, their comfort in their actual living space marking trust, built incrementally, and Brandon brought gifts reflecting genuine knowledge of their interests, rather than expensive items designed to purchase affection. River pulled Brandon aside to tell him she'd decided on Papa B, if that was okay, the compromise acknowledging biological connection without competing with Alex's position as dad, creating space for both relationships without forcing choice. Brandon cried hearing the nickname, and River's uncomfortable recognition that she'd made him cry by being kind became her lesson about power children held with parents who'd failed them, and she found herself feeling protective in ways that surprised her. Willow settled on Father Brandon, which maintained distance she needed while acknowledging biological relationship, and Brandon accepted her choice with same gratitude, because any title that allowed identification as their father felt like grace he didn't deserve, but desperately treasured. The custody arrangement stabilized into pattern, where River and Willow spent time with Brandon, plus alternating holidays, their lives primarily centered in home they shared with Nicola and Alex, but expanded to include biological father who'd earned access through showing up without failures. River and Willow's understanding of family complexity made them wise beyond years. Their acceptance that they had dad who raised them and biological father learning to be present, teaching them early that relationships existed on spectrums, that people could fail and grow, that love through daily presence mattered more than love through genetics alone. Brandon's transformation from arrogant CEO into man who showed up reliably represented only redemption available to someone who'd missed too much to reclaim what he'd thrown away. And he accepted his role as important but secondary, present but not primary, forgiven in only way that mattered by being allowed to know his daughters and contribute to their futures. The soccer championship became their complicated shared territory, and when River scored winning goal, she looked immediately toward Alex for approval before allowing herself to meet Brandon's eyes with acknowledgement that she'd found way to hold space for man who'd missed early years without diminishing man who'd been there for everything. Nicola felt something settle watching them exist together without overt tension, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps acceptance that their fractured family had been reconstructed into something functional if not fully healed, and letting go of rage didn't mean pretending Brandon hadn't hurt her, but rather choosing not to let that hurt define the rest of her life. Brandon drove home to an apartment that felt less empty because it held evidence of River and Willow's presence. Drawings on his refrigerator and trophy, River let him keep as duplicate, and these small gestures represented more progress than he'd expected to achieve with daughters who had every reason to reject him permanently. He visited his son with Danny the next day, making genuine effort to be present during limited custody. And while he still struggled with being emotionally available for infant who deserved better than distracted father, he was trying in ways that felt more authentic, and Danny's surprised acknowledgement that he seemed different suggested perhaps his work with River and Willow was teaching him how to be present for all his children. The photograph arrived weeks later in envelope with Nicola's return address. No explanation included, just family portrait showing Nicola and Alex and twins in professional poses capturing their family unit, and tucked into corner of frame was small hand-drawn picture that Willow had created showing stick figure of Brandon standing slightly apart from main family group but still within frame's boundaries. He stared at it for a long time, at evidence that he would never be subject of their family portrait, but rather footnote tucked into corner. And instead of devastation he might have felt months ago, Brandon found himself feeling grateful for even that small acknowledgement. His mother's curse haunted him sometimes, her prediction that River and Willow would eventually reject him the way he'd rejected her. But watching his daughters include him even as footnote rather than subject proved that her prophecy was wrong. That earned love through consistent presence mattered more than unconditional love claimed through manipulation. Brandon understood finally that being footnote in his daughters' lives was more than he'd deserved, and exactly what redemption looked like for someone who'd missed everything that mattered most, and he found peace with that permanent secondary position because being remembered at all was grace. He'd spend the rest of his life trying to honor through continued presence, rather than dramatic gestures that meant nothing without follow-through.